All right, it looks like we're at 3:01, so we still have a few people trickling in, but we'll let them join as they are permitted to do so. We'd like to welcome you to the Zoning Code Rewrite Citywide Advisory Committee meeting. This is a regularly scheduled meeting for Thursday, July 15th. And we will be talking about parking, landscaping, and building design as we move forward. Just as always, we'll kind of just go over that we are a sounding board as our committee. And so we are gathering direction, and we're hoping that you can answer some questions for us throughout the process. We just ask that you be ready to learn and do your best and really actively listen to one another as we move forward, using kindness as our key process, and then thinking with an open mind, thinks about our community as a whole, and then really thinking about some of our project goals. And you guys each have those, as well as the city's vision and the mission, which is ultimately to create a city for everyone, no matter who you are. As we move forward, I just wanted to let you know that there's been a lot of discussion about when do we transition from virtual meetings to in-person meetings, and we're working behind the scenes for that, and we'll visit with you again at our August meeting and let you know if that transition is right for us in September. So if you have additional comments, go ahead and let us know about those. We heard from 16 of you in our survey, so that's a great turnout, and we appreciate you providing comment in regard to that. And then also, as you receive your minutes from this meeting, once I present those to you tomorrow, you're going to notice that in your post Citywide Advisory Committee survey, there's going to be an additional section at the bottom that says, hey, do you have any other questions or comments that you want to give to us that may not be specific to those comments that we talk about today pertaining to parking, landscaping, or building design? We had a recommendation from one of our Citywide Advisory Committee members, and so we've integrated that. So feel free to use that if you have additional comments that you'd like to share with us. As Dawn has said multiple times, we're gathering comments in any way that you want to provide those. So that's just one more avenue that you can provide that information to us and the larger project team. So really, I just wanted to get us kicked off, let you know that we are considering transitioning to that in-person meetings, and then welcome you and thank you for being here with us today. And then I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Don Elliott, our consulting partner with Clarion Associates, and he's going to take us through those 3 big questions for us. And then I'll just be facilitating in the background, and we'll also welcome any comments from our committee members. So take it away, Don.
Thank you very much. Good to see such a continued good turnout of this group. We're working our way through this, and it's not easy going. Some of these are very technical topics. Today's are a little bit more fun than some, in the sense that a lot of people have opinions about these topics. And so I hope we get good discussion and maybe also hear from some people we haven't heard from before on the group here. Although, as I've said, and as Andrea said, we don't need to hear it here. We can hear it in writing. We can hear it other places. Let me share my screen and see if I can do that. Let's see if this is ready. Can you tell me whether or not you're seeing my screen?
It looks good.
Yep, okay. I can see it.
It's full screen mode too, right? Okay, good. Right? You're not seeing 2 little pictures. You're seeing one big picture.
No,
right?
I see 2 pictures.
Ah, there you go. So hang on a second. Let me switch them around here, and we'll work it out. Just a second. Let me get over here. Want to get over here? How about now?
There you go. You're in business.
Boy, I've only been doing this for 15 months during COVID. You'd think eventually even I could be trained. So apparently not. Okay, so I want to go back to the beginning just here. Obviously, it's July 15th. You have seen this diagram many times. I hope you have noticed that although it is slow progress, it is progress. We are moving ourselves from left to right along here, still accepting input on the module 1, and we'll continue to do so. We are working towards having public comment on module 2, getting it in front of you, and then getting it in front of the public, by the next meeting. That's our goal. And so we're going to kind of hit another benchmark very soon here. So I'm going to do this and say, let's go back to the breakdown very briefly. In module 2, module 1 was districts and uses. Module 2, we broke down into kind of a 4-month system here. And we did it deliberately because lots of people have opinions about lot and building design, particularly height, particularly setbacks, particularly how close it can be to other things. We pushed for a separate session on that. It was technical. It will remain one that I think people will comment on as the module comes out. We had last month on these 3 issues of kind of the fabric of how the city grows and redeveloped, meaning subdivisions. How do you stay from sensitive lands? How do you achieve access and connectivity? So it really is a city for everyone, even those who are mobility impaired. Those are kind of the framework of how you build a city. And that's why we wanted to talk to them in one group. And today, parking, landscaping, lighting, and other development standards, which I would be surprised if people don't have opinions about them. Our goal is, as we did with module 1, to get this revised and ready and presented to you so that our meeting in August can be walking through, orienting you to it, and highlighting changes or things that you need to know right up front. These are big changes, or they're not big changes, or there's been a lot of conversation. That's our goal for August. So let me pause for just a second. And I think what I'll do is let Andrea Honcho this. It's hard for me to have all my screens up at one time to see everybody and see all these different presentations. So what I'm going to say is, Andrea, could you tell me whether anybody has, I just ask, do you have questions about what we talked about last time? Subdivision, sensitive lands, access and connectivity that you have not passed on in written comments, or came up after the meeting, you forgot to mention them, or came up in a conversation that you had with somebody in the intervening month?
So I am managing the chat and I'm not seeing anything. I'm not seeing any hands raised thus far either.
All right. Then we'll move on in the interest of time. It's a nice summer day. So I did want to point out, as background for this, we have 3 questions. We're going to talk about 3 topics. You could talk about anything, and I'll highlight some of the other things as we go along that you may want to have comments on. But Boise has a very robust system of design review. And in the current ordinance, you have these 2 systems. You have citywide design standards and guidelines, and you have downtown design standards and guidelines. They are both very high quality documents. They are both very detailed. They offer a lot of guidance. And as we have said before, and I'm not pointing a finger, the more guidance you give on design, the more detailed it is, the more likely it is what you ask for on page 15 cannot be done on the same site at the same time as the one you ask for on page 40. The more you say, the more likely it is that on a site with a particular building program or development proposal, this and that cannot be optimized at the same time. So we have been asked early on, and we've had this question, are we going to refine this? And the short answer is the design review system is not part of module 2. It'll be part of module 3. No one has asked us to get rid of it. You will, unless someone really changes course here on the behalf of the city leadership, no one has said get rid of design review, and we do not plan to get rid of design review. However, having said that, in our early kickoffs, there were a lot of comments about how this process takes a lot of time. There are debates about whether we're trying to optimize what's on page 15 or page 40 or page 67. And it adds time, expense, and unpredictability to the process. That is not pointing a finger at Boise. I'll go out on a limb and say that's true of every discretionary design review process. When cities adopt them, it's because they think the advantages outweigh the disadvantages, that they get better design, and the better design is worth the time, expense, and unpredictability of going through the process. No one has asked us to dismantle that process. They have asked us all the way from the beginning. Blueprint Boise talks about improved design many times, often, that you want a better designed built environment than you have had in the past. And so what we have done is refer to these two documents, and I'll talk about this more later, incorporated basic ones, things that frankly we are recommending should not be negotiated. They are fundamentals. And in many cities without a discretionary design review process, they would just say, you need to do this. We can offer some flexibility. We understand design is an art. We understand there are different ways of solving design problems, but we're not really interested in negotiating the fundamentals of pedestrian-oriented design, or if it's not in an urban setting, less pedestrian-oriented design. And we acknowledge that there's a lot of it that can be negotiated and can be refined. So you'll see that we have referred to this, and this is not just building design. It covers other things in here. It covers things that overlap with parking, with landscaping, with lighting, with other things in both of these. Now, in your current ordinance, these two are overlay districts. They are another layer of zoning. We said 6 months ago, you don't need to make them overlay districts. And the more overlay districts you have, the harder the code is to administer. Take these things, keep your guidelines, your shoulds in these documents, take the fundamentals of design and put it in the code. That you could basically put those in as standards. That's why they're in module 2. That's why in module 1, we said, do not carry these over as overlay districts, as another layer of zoning. Most cities do not. It's not necessary. You just write them down. For this type of development, the following are required. So, and I'm raising it now at the start because, again, it's not just building design. It overlaps with site design, where the parking is, landscaping, lighting, etc. So the basics, and we are exercising judgment here, of what other medium-sized cities that are fairly auto-oriented, but striving to create a transit system, to create areas of urbanism and activity centers, what should be kind of in the code as basics. And so what we've done is take some parts of these and put them in the code. And then you will find when you read module 2, there is kind of a safety net at the end of the sections that they relate to that says, if the Boise design guidelines say you shall comply with this, it's a shall, not a should, then you need to comply with it. But, and this is, we had to think this through and parse it. There is stuff that Clarion recommends does belong in the code. You'll see that in module 2. There are shalls in these two documents that are very, very detailed for the topics that they address, and that we recommend do not come into the code because they would add a lot of length. And even though they're shalls, we think there is a high likelihood they would need to be negotiated and traded against each other. And so we have left them in these two documents. So these documents don't just, at the end of this process, when the new code's adopted, and you have put some of the basics in here, you'll still need these two documents. Probably what will happen is that the things that we've taken into the code will be taken out of these documents. There's no need to say it twice. But what will be left is not the stuff we put in the code, but some shalls and the shoulds. Shoulds means it doesn't say you have to do this. It says Boise wants you to do this in this kind of a corporation. So these two documents are fundamental to this conversation today. They will remain in effect. Parts of them have been brought in. Not all of the mandatory content has been brought in, but the module 2 says, if it says in these two documents, shall, then that is a shall. That is a shall in Boise. So we'll talk about, but I'd like to talk about this at the end, but I wanted to lay this foundation. So let's talk about parking and loading. By the way, parking loading also includes kind of stacking of drive-through uses if you have them. So what are the trends? We have two or three slides and then we'll ask our parking question. There are, I don't know any code that has increased its parking requirements generally over the past 2 decades. Most of them are reduced. This is a tricky issue because even though I know we have many people on this committee that are very invested in parking and very much would like either them reduced or eliminated altogether. We've had a couple of eloquent writings and statements in our meetings about just get rid of them. I have to tell you, there are many people in every major city who think the problem is just the opposite, who think the problem is that there's not enough parking because they can't park conveniently. So this is, even though this meeting may not reflect it, we need to take it seriously. There will be voices all the way through the process saying, well, no, you guys got it wrong. Now, having said that, I don't, with a few exceptions, very few exceptions, when we review codes, we look at the rates, we compare them with other cities that we think are comparable in various characteristics, and usually they go down. So, but let's talk about this. We have had at least a couple of people say, eliminate them. That is a trend. It is happening. There are cities out there that have said, we're not going to regulate this anymore. It is more trouble than it's worth. And history shows that despite our best efforts, we tend to over require it. Now, when people say eliminate it, it is much more often done for downtown than other places. 50% of the downtowns in America don't have parking minimums. The other 50% do. I can't tell the difference. So for downtowns, you know, uses come, uses go, buildings go up, buildings get redeveloped, buildings come down. And the truth is, downtowns in many places operate as a general pool of parking. If the rates go up over here, I start parking over there. So it's very common to eliminate them for downtown, and it is increasingly common to either reduce or eliminate them for activity centers, for mixed use and non-residential. It is still relatively rare for cities to say, in our residential districts, we are eliminating parking requirements. I think we'll have a robust discussion about that. There are clearly examples out there of cities that have said, where Buffalo, New York has just said, we don't do this. We don't do this. We'll let the market figure it out. And there are others. So maximum parking. Should there be cases in which you may not provide that much parking? The classic example is shopping malls that the banks want to see enough parking for the day after Thanksgiving, the biggest parking day of the year. Most planners would say that is a really bad way to use land. You don't plan anything for the biggest possible day, especially when the biggest possible day is twice as much as most of the other days. You just don't do that. That's land inefficient. So increasingly they all have this conversation. Do you need maximum parking? Yes, we should have it, or no. When they adopt it, increasingly, our opinion is they don't just say the maximum is 125% of the minimum. The maximum is 150% of the minimum. It turns out that creates a lot of unintended consequences. So instead, the trend is to focus and say these uses, like shopping centers, are the ones that are most likely to overpark in ways that spread things apart, make them less walkable, harder to get to except in a car, and tailor maximum parking to the things that are actually creating what plans like Blueprint Boise say are problems. These create walkability problems. You know, if I own a little shopette somewhere and I have 4 parking spaces, or I'm going to build one, and the question is, do I have 4 or 6 parking spaces? 150, the minimum's more, the maximum's 6. Who cares? It doesn't matter. The difference between 4 parking spaces and 6 doesn't create a walkability problem. So increasingly, they're tailored. More codes are requiring bicycle parking. More codes are requiring electrical vehicle charging to be in larger lots, and or saying, we'll reduce your parking. We'll either require it, or when you provide it, we will reduce the amount of minimum parking you need. There are usually multiple ways to adjust things downward to reflect the fact that you're near transit. Availability of public parking. I've written at least 10 different ways that recent codes have said, if you're near public parking, fine. If you have on-street parking, fine. If you provide us van pool and carpool places, you're reduced. Proximity to transit is more likely you'll ride the bus, you're reduced, etc. And increasingly, parking is required in most contexts, not every context, to be behind or beside the buildings in most mixed use and non-residential areas. Are there still arterial corridors where it makes sense to have the parking on the street? The street is so big that the truth is it will never be pedestrian oriented, and it doesn't matter. There are some. If those of you know Colorado or Denver, Colorado Boulevard is like an 8-lane arterial. Very important, very congested on Saturdays. My personal opinion is Colorado Boulevard will never be pedestrian oriented. There will never be people strolling down Colorado Boulevard and having lattes under umbrellas. It doesn't make sense. And so in areas like that, sometimes where there's high volumes of car traffic and not a realistic sense that this will be a pedestrian corridor, they often say, well, we don't care so much whether you put parking behind the building. Albuquerque has a category of roads and design standards that says basically, hey, we know what this road is for. It's getting from the north side of Albuquerque to the south side of Albuquerque. That's what it does. And we are going to zone appropriately. This is a commuter road, high volumes, fairly fast. Nobody's going to walk along this road. We're going to be reasoned about this. So I showed these two issues because I showed this in a webinar the other day. The top picture is a true parking congestion. That's a problem if those guys are parked. The bottom is not. That's my block. And I have neighbors who say, well, it's all parked up. And I say, no, I'm sorry, that's not all parked up. So, but this is what we're going to have to talk about. I wanted to show you when you see module 2. This is just a clip. Please don't memorize this because it's just a clip to show you how it's organized. It will say on the left-hand column, what are the uses we're talking about? And this assumes that you keep them because I think we have, people may say, let's just repeal them. But if you don't repeal them, and module 2 has not, the draft itself, as of this meeting, as of right now, until somebody tells me otherwise, has not taken out this chapter. The left-hand side is the list of uses which matches up with what's in the use table. The middle is your current standards, and you have 3 parking overlays. These are like your design overlays. We said, don't do that. Just put them in here, map the areas in the parking chapter and say, and right before this table, it says, here's a map. If it's P1, you are not required to have parking. That's the core of your downtown. You already have done that. I don't want to have a column in here that says not applicable all the way through. So before the table, we said P1 is not applicable. P2 and P3 are lesser reductions. So there's a general thing, and then there's a map that says P2 and P3 have reductions. And that those tie. We have not proposed a remapping of those areas. It's a transfer of your overlay districts into standards. Now, on the right is the recommended, and we have changed those. We have done what we think is our job. We have gone through and put a minimum on there. This clip shows only one. In this clip, we have not distinguished between general P2 and P3 for brew pubs. Exactly, the recommendation in this clip is 3 per 1,000. And it doesn't distinguish. Other portions of the table, we do. Other portions of the table where you currently say less is possible in P1, in P2 or P3, we do carry it forward. We did not throw that away. However, in a number of cases, we looked at the standards around the country and we said, the standards you have for P2 or P3 are the national standards emerging. So why, if the national standard is the reduction you're giving in the downtown area, then we don't need to have a difference between these areas. And so I want to emphasize that the clip you're looking for is not the way the whole code is. It is simply, I happen to clip this in, and it turns out that these are examples of places where we have not carried over that distinction. And then the maximums are in the right-hand column, recommended. Now, when this is to help you compare it and help builders and bankers, when the code reaches city council after all the massaging and or if it's still here, if it hasn't been deleted because parking was deleted, if it reaches city council, we will take out that middle section and all we'll have is the right and the left. The point of it in now is to allow you to see, wow, they really reduced that. I hate that. Or wow, they really reduced that. I love that. The point we've learned over time, it's very hard to footnote these changes. Just show them on the table. And when you adopt it, take out the middle column and leave it with what the new one is. So last one, our next slide, I think here is parking adjustments. This table on the left is a table that will appear in module 2 that talks about how do you reduce parking when you are having mixed use. And the emerging practice around the country is something like this. If you have, I'm just giving you an example, if you had public and institutional use next to food and beverage use in this table, you would add up the square footage of each use, apply the parking standards, and then divide by 1.2. That's how it works. If it was the bottom left, if you had multifamily dwellings next to other commercial, you would add it up and you would divide by 1.3. And so that is the shared parking adjustment, which is intended to be much more objective and much more predictable than what you have now. Parking adjustments, I've listed them there. Shared is the table. On-street parking, motorcycle parking, affordable housing, transit supportive, adaptive reuse, transportation management, and adjustments. Those fourth, fifth, and sixth bullets, affordable housing, transit supportive housing, and adaptive reuse housing, are not new. They're in your affordable housing bonus ordinance that council adopted a year ago when we were just getting going on this. But they are parking reductions related to affordable housing. They don't stand on their own. Part of our job here was to take those and put them in here and use the same terminology. And they have been adjusted to line with the other changes we've made as we've drafted the code. So they're not identical. They are intended to be not more generous, not less generous. We didn't try to renegotiate the deal, but we had to align it with different uses and different districts. And so it is intended to be a conversion of what council approved a year ago, integrated into a general section of the different things you can do to reduce parking. So we also, that you'll see in the chapter when we do it, it also addresses drive-through facilities and stacking areas, and it addresses parking lot design. It does not address, the chapter here doesn't address parking lot landscaping, because we believe that landscaping should be designed by the site designer all as one. And that's our next topic after our break, is landscaping. In the way Clarion recommends is that parking lot landscaping is a part of landscaping chapter, because you really want the landscape architect to be optimizing all of the pieces of required landscaping. So what the parking chapter says is, thou shalt landscape per the parking section of the landscaping chapter. And then this chapter also deals with loading facilities. So Blueprint Boise says, create incentives such as reduced parking requirements, deferred development impact fees, which we have not addressed in here so far, or have not planned to address because it's an impact fee question. When specific transportation demand management parking techniques are implemented. So TDM is jargon. In planner speak, it means you have a study or a plan about how you're going to manage transportation demands, and you think you can get by with less, usually less. Sometimes it's a request to do more, but a TDM is a transportation demand management plan that basically says, in Blueprint Boise, open the door to people who have a plan to do a better job than just the reduced parking requirements, and allow them to put the plan in front of the city and reduce the parking requirements. To reduce the amount of parking requirements, establish maximums. I've just explained that. Promote the provision of safe, secure bicycle parking, shower locker storage facilities. So those are all things that Blueprint Boise said. So the question is, should minimum parking standards be removed? And if so, where? I know it's been raised. And where should maximum parking standards apply? I know this group well enough to know that if you have a separate comment on a different parking topic, you will feel free to comment. So that's the question. Could you, Han, show the chat box, Andrea, while we do this?
Yes. So Patrick Spouts had a question. If you could go back to the slide that has here's what the current and proposed, it was an example sheet of parking right there. And he asked, can you convert the space per seat into approximate spaces per set footage, simply because it's hard to compare without a conversion factor? And then Patrick also has his hand raised. And so we may want to hear from him to see if he wants to elaborate on that comment at all.
Okay. So the answer to Patrick's first question is no, there's not an exact conversion factor. Once again, it's not necessarily a bad practice to have parking based on seats, but it in places like schools and universities, it's sometimes hard to do, because which seats? Usually it means the seats in the biggest assembly areas, but sometimes the assembly area is almost never used. And what's really relevant is the seats in the classrooms. And you don't want to add up all the seats in the classrooms because they're not all occupied at the same time. And so when possible, we move away from per employee. I really don't like per employee, because employees come and go. Today we employ 20, tomorrow we employ 25. Yesterday we were in compliance, today we're not in compliance. So the point is, I don't like to use employees. We don't like to use seats. If we can find a comparison, GFA is gross floor area. In our opinion, that's the easiest way to do this, because everybody, and we sometimes have developers say, can I do net floor area? Meaning, let's ignore elevator wells and stairwells and storage rooms and things like that. Yeah, we could, but every city measures those differently. It's a much easier, because every building application or site plan tells you how many feet of gross floor area you're going to have. Just adjust them to say, we think this converts into the following amount of gross floor area. And Patrick, the conversion is not the same for every use. In some cases, I did this work. And so going through here and saying, they say, so many per 3 seats, I could apply a factor and get to a number. But wow, we're looking around and that's still too high. Most cities have a lower number than that or a higher number than that. And so there are conversion factors, but it's not a standard conversion factor. And we didn't just do that. We went through and said, what they've paid us to do is to look at what other cities require and whether it's adequate. And so that's what we've done. You could derive a conversion factor, but you find it's different in many cases. So
right, that's all fair. That's why I asked for approximate, because I can't actually tell if this is more or less parking on the right than the left. I can't tell what kind of change that really means.
And that I sympathize with you. For the reason I said, I won't take more time to say. Sure. It's hard for us to tell. It all depends on how you would have counted the seats.
Okay, then that's difficult. Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
So thanks.
One thing that I would also like to add to that, so currently our restaurants do talk about per seat, but when we talk about office or retail, we talk about gross floor area. And so when you're in a mixed use zone or, perhaps a strip mall or something like that, tenants change over time. And so oftentimes gross floor area provides a little more consistency for you so that you can start to integrate restaurants. And then, if for some reason that doesn't thrive there, we can then integrate a retail use relatively easily. So gross floor area is a relatively good way to go. We do have one more comment that came from Roberta, that parking is always going to be an issue, especially in more dense housing situations. Minimum parking standards need to be maintained. Maybe they should be modified, perhaps, but yet we do need to have those parking minimums. And then we have a couple of hand raised. So let's call on Ian, followed by Byron.
Yeah, thank you. I was just typing up a response to what Patrick was asking. And Don kind of touched on this a little bit. For a comparison, you might be looking at a restaurant or a brew pub, and you're going to look at the occupant load that's required by the building code. And that will tell you, per this many square feet, for example, tables and chairs, non-fixed is 15 net square feet. So I'm going to have one occupant for 15 square feet roughly. So granted, that does change. It's a moving target depending on what your occupancy is, if it's assembly, if it's education, business, etc. So I agree. It's not readily clear how it relates from the left to the right, but I was hoping that could kind of help explain this comment. Sorry.
Oh no, that's helpful. It's, this is one of those areas of code writing where, frankly, I'm not trying to evade the conversation. If we want to plow into it in more detail offline, we can do that. I think this is one of those cases where, kind of like the use table, it is, in our opinion, we try to footnote the changes so that we're being transparent. People know. And those who care, those who have a restaurant, can go through and say, wow, I would have had to do this much, and under the new rule, I do that. Do I think that's fair? The bottom line is this what you want? Is this, in my mind, it is more important to know whether that next to the right-hand column is in the opinions of those who do these things, builders, neighbors, but also builders and engineers and bankers and financiers. Does that seem right? And I mean very clearly, does that seem more than the city's going to require? Because if a bank requires more, often they do more. The goal of that next to right-hand column is not to guess what the banks will do. It is to achieve the two things that cities are supposed to achieve through parking ratios, if you decide to keep them. Avoiding traffic congestion, avoiding people double parking and screwing up the road system and the circulation, which is a public safety problem because they provided inadequate parking. That's a legitimate public health and safety issue. That's why parking came in the beginning. And secondly, legitimate is avoiding overflow parking in the neighborhoods. It is not fun to live next to an activity center and have people reuse buildings or build new buildings. Like, it doesn't matter. They'll just park 3 blocks away in the neighborhood. I'm not saying that's an engineering problem. I'm saying it's a political problem. Most people will stand up and say, you know what? And I've been in these meetings. There are people parking in and blocking up our block, not because they're just the public waiting area, but to go to something 5 blocks away. And that seems like a job the city should have foreseen and not done. And so, anyway, those are the 2 points. Neighborhood overflow parking is usually considered a valid reason, and traffic congestion is a very valid reason. Other than that, we're not supposed to be guessing what the market wants. This is public protection numbers. So.
Byron, you want to take it away?
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. So Don, I just have a question before I pop in with parking minimums. Are most cities still calculating in residential zones parking minimums per living unit? Or are any cities really looking at, because that provides a little bit of undue punishment on smaller infill lots, specifically as we're talking about, allowing triplexes and fourplexes on smaller lots, requiring parking ratios the same way that we calculate densities, places an undue burden on smaller lots, the smaller the lot is, right? So I'm wondering if other cities are calculating outside of the living unit ratio.
A few, not many. Most are still doing a per dwelling unit system. I'll answer your question a different way. Rather than having a different ratio for small lots, I have seen some parking standards that basically exempt small lots from both commercial and residential parking. They just set a number, 5,000 square feet, 7,000 square feet, 7,500 square feet, and say, these are small lots. They were platted a long time ago. And we can have standards as to how much building can occupy that lot. And you can avoid overcrowding that way, the massing, the height, the setbacks, the lot coverage. We can do that. But it's going to be really hard to reuse this if this person has to provide more parking when they reuse it. And so we just exempt small lots from parking requirements, more often in commercial and mixed use than in residential, but sometimes in residential. So I haven't seen a kind of a 2-tiered approach. And yes, it's mostly done by dwelling unit. And the fix is not to have 2 ratios. In my experience, it's to exempt things that you think are going to have a very hard time complying.
Great, thank you. That's helpful.
So I do have some comments in the chat. So ultimately, Patrick has stated, requiring more parking generally means more expensive and fewer housing options. The hard trade-offs with housing opportunity and better transit and walkability make me want to substantially reduce them.
Yep.
And then Roberta also stated, I have not seen car share options take off here in Boise. For example, Zipcar, which operates similar to the bike share option. It's handy with proposing increasing more bicycle parking as well as more electrical vehicle charging stations to reduce car usage and promote car share options.
Okay, that's good. Let me play devil's advocate, guys. This is a big deal. This we're going to have this debate go on. A few people have weighed in here. You already have P1 downtown. You say, look, let the market figure this out. Then you've got these P2 and P3 gradations out from downtown. No one has really complained about it. Clarion was the one who said, yeah, we don't object, but you're doing this wrong. It shouldn't be an overlay district. Or you're doing it in an awkward way. Don't do it as an overlay district. That's what we've done. Why shouldn't we just repeal parking requirements in the activity centers? Activities, walkable, sustainable, pedestrian-oriented, transit-supportive activity centers are all over Blueprint Boise. When you want nodes of service, and again, we've got zone districts to talk about small ones and medium ones that are intended to be located, medium ones where it can support transit, smaller ones where they can be sources of locals, daily goods that don't require you to get in the car and go somewhere. Why? I'm not advocating. I'm asking a legitimate question. Why would we have parking requirements in those areas? Should we take the logic that went behind somebody saying we don't need these in downtown Boise and say, well, we also don't need them in the activity centers? Is it simply a question that the activity centers are near residential, and so people are scared about overflow parking into the residential areas around activity centers? I mean, that would be a fine response to that, and nobody has to respond. But that's one answer.
Shellen is agreeing. And we have Esther raising a hand. Esther, take it away.
Thank you. So Don, I'm thinking of current activity centers like Hyde Park. And as someone whose partner has lived a block away from Hyde Park for 20 years, the parking, it just extends to the adjacent and then, like maybe a 2 or 3 blocks radius from the Hyde Park area. So I can see why you could have some folks in those in activity centers like Hyde Park be opposed to eliminating parking for businesses. But I'm actually thinking of, the State Street corridor. Development along the State Street corridor, in my opinion, should have reduced parking spaces because we have this option of alternative transportation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So.
Well, let me draw you out a little bit on that, or anybody else who wants to weigh in. So another alternative would be along the State Street corridor. Let's treat it like P2 or P3. It's not downtown. We don't waive them all together, and so you don't have to do it. We say, just as downtown has a penumbra, circles of reduced parking around it, State Street isn't P1. It's not downtown Boise, but it's more like P2. There's a good bus system, and there will be a better bus system. Let's do some reduced version in there, so that if I was showing you a different page of this table, it might have in the recommended P2 is X spaces. That's the one that ought to apply. And so maybe one possible alternative is this is a fine approach, but map some of the street activity centers as P2.
Okay, we have some comments that are also coming in. So Byron says that he fully agrees that parking minimums should be waived in activity centers. Roberta has said, the issue is more likely one for business owners, as a lot of people will not walk to shop. Why she would, a lot of her friends or affiliates would not go to locations where they don't have parking. Patrick has said most businesses will choose to have parking for that reason. Yep. This is just about a minimum where a business could have less if they choose to.
Yeah. So
lots of really good discussion happening. And then we also have 2 hands raised. So Patrick, followed by Richard.
I'm sure my opinions won't be surprising to anyone, but I'll get them verbally on the record. And want to touch on the Hyde Park question. I live near Hyde Park, and there's parking in front of my house all the time. But I'm attracted to here because I like the walkable area, and I'm happy that people use it. And I think it's great that Hyde Park exists. And if we required large amounts of parking for it to exist, it wouldn't be like that at all. So that's something that a lower parking standards allows to exist. It's kind of a question of what do we want to see? And if we like the Hyde Park thing, that is partially the world you get. And yes, there's some congested street parking. That is a consequence that comes from this. But I think the benefits are super, super large. And that's why I want to live here. And judging by the prices in the North End, many other people want to live right here in the middle of it because it's a wonderful amenity.
Okay. Patrick, I'm sorry, I know you have another hand raised probably, but Patrick, let me just be clear. You've said twice today, I think, reduced parking. I thought you'd weighed in earlier and asking that they just be eliminated. I want to.
Oh, that's my real view, but then we're talking within what you made clear was the realm of the political possible. So okay. I'm working toward consensus. Okay. I am convinced, the Shoup, et cetera, that on the merits, it works out well. And you may have to do more to manage street parking. you may have to permit for resident and things like that would involve some changes, and that may not be a political winnable battle. But as far as like, I am deeply convinced, if you're asking what is like good for a city, that when you come out the other side is a better place with a huge, positive consumer surplus and a happy situation, would be removing them entirely. The housing piece is key, but everything else can work out quite well. And there's others showing that it can be done. And a lot of places people love are places that are not full of parking.
Yeah, that's very true. Okay, so I want to be clear, and Pedrick's kind of hinted at something, which is that an alternative view of this would be, I have never seen a pure version of this, but it's emerging in places around the country. We're not going to tell you how much parking you have to have on your site. We're going to tell you, we're going to expand our neighborhood protection permit systems and just say, we're going to tell you where you can't park. It is easier for us to do that and less land inefficient and more walkable to have builders and developers scratching their heads over how much they really need rather than just telling them a minimum. So there is an alternative look at this and saying, why are we telling them how much this guy needs? Why don't we just tell him where he can't park and they'll figure it out. So anyway, I'll happy to take the next hand.
That's Richard. So he's patiently waiting.
Yeah, thank you. That's okay. I just had barking dogs, so just as well that I had to wait. So my general perspective has been less parking is good. It's certainly something I've actually asked for, but I've kind of changed that as I've kind of seen what's happened on the ground, not just on paper, but on the ground. And that is, out in a neighborhood like ours, which, the divergent opinions of ACHD and Boise and the way that neighborhoods can kind of fall through the cracks in terms of how standards are implemented or not implemented, really has given me pause. And I think some really poor decisions have been made. ACHD out here, because they call it a rural area, even though they're, we're building 3 or 4 story apartments. They say that swales are appropriate, and how this interacts with parking can be fairly complex, but basically it means that on the street parking is then forced out farther into the street. And especially when you couple this with intersections that are not up to standards right off of State Street where traffic is traveling at 60 miles per hour, it really does pose a hazard, and it's going to pose additional hazards. And then that gets me to a point about State Street. I agree with Esther, I believe, talking about State Street through her neighborhood. We have to remember there's really 2 State Streets in what is now Boise, west of the Glenwood Shopping Center. It then goes to ITD's jurisdiction. And there's all sorts of problems there. We're not allowed to have HOV lanes on that section. It's unlikely that we will actually have any bus stops, in our neighborhood, the 3 miles or so out to Eagle, in the foreseeable future. Talking to CCDC a little bit ago, admitted it could easily be 10 to 15 years before such bus stops were created. And part of that is just that it's not known if we're going to expand State Street through that area. Like I said, HOV lanes are illegal, so having a bus stop in 60 mile per hour traffic just is not very likely. And so it is problematic. I mean, I wish it wasn't the case, and we've advocated for the city to be stronger about this with little avail. But if we actually, had transportation, useful transportation, or we could see that we'd actually get it in the near future, then having the continuation of so-called transit-oriented development with minimum parking would make a lot of sense. But we don't. I mean, that's just and the problem when you don't do that, and yet you pretend you're doing it, it causes a lot of problems. And so that's kind of my perspective. It's kind of the difference between what is happening on the ground out here, the kind of failure for the agencies to work in a way that makes sense. It just makes reducing parking more problematic, unfortunately. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we do have a hand up from Chris, but before we take Chris, I'm going to go through because we have 7 comments. So I'm going to quickly run through those, and then just for to keep us on a timely watch, we have 5 to 6 minutes left to talk about this particular question. If it gets really in depth, we'll understand that there's some trade-offs that can happen later down the line. So Shellen has said, parking requirements should be related to access to services and multimodal transit. I'm not certain if an activity center is the only place that would meet those criteria. I feel strongly parking should be reduced in order to help incentivize people, developers to design around people and not cars. At least in multifamily housing, the market will drive the parking standards, not necessarily the code. Chris has followed up saying, I'm also thinking of bound crossing where there is walkability factor for some in the neighborhood and Greenbelt users, but also people that come from across the Treasure Valley to the area. So some parking is necessary for those who do not live in the neighborhood or nearby, but reduced parking is helpful to maintain walkability and a mini activity center sort of feel. Ian has followed up and said, I agree with Shellen. That's an interesting idea of market driving amount of parking. For reference, Hyde Park could most likely not be created under our current parking standards. Esther has followed up with, I agree with Shellen, parking should be reduced in order to help incentivize people and developers to design around people, not cars. Roberta has said, bound crossing is what I was exactly thinking of. Richard is very garbled, and Richard, we did some of your voice was garbled as you were speaking. And then let's see, Byron has said, that's a good point, Chris. My hope would be that possibly all of our neighborhood activity centers would be walkable so that neighborhoods would be able to meet their many needs within walking distance. Right now, Hyde Park and Bound Crossing are activity centers that are destinations for people from other neighborhoods looking for that experience. So we've got a lot happening. Chris has his hand raised. We also want to hear from Ben because we are talking about not only commercial or mixed use, we're talking about residential. So thinking about those in multiple facets. So
Andrea, can I just weigh in? I want to assure Richard, your technology was making your voice break up, but we could understand the points you were making. They were clear to me. So your point got across, even though technology was not your friend today. So thanks. Okay.
All right, Chris, go ahead and take it away. And then Ben, if you'll stand in the batter's box, followed by Marissa.
So yeah, just one quick thing in relation to the State Street one, and then I want to go back to a point that Don made. For the State Street corridor, I think part of the problem is that once you get to Glenwood, half of the street is Garden City and half of it is Boise's, which creates some problems in how you would actually respond to creating a sort of activity center when it's not all under Boise's jurisdiction. So I think that's just one thing that may contribute to some of that. But the question that I had when Don mentioned maybe creating places where you can't park. I just wanted some clarification on that, if that involves things like neighborhood parking permits for residents. So when I lived downtown, we had parking zones that were free for residents, and you got like a sticker and allowed residents to park indefinitely in like the 1 to 2 hour parking zones, but then limited parking to the time limit for anyone that was coming in. And is that kind of the idea you're thinking of, or did you have other ideas for the where you can't park kind of?
No, that was the primary reason. Cities increasingly have those. They're kind of reluctant because they're a little bit labor intensive to administer, and also when you have guests, how many do you have a sticker? Do you have a card? Do you have a permit you can hand to your guests? They are not a silver bullet behind this, but that's exactly what I was thinking of, and I do see it happening around the country where there is a trend for more areas to say, look, we don't have a minimum, but we're going to make this so that it meets the needs of the neighborhood, meaning don't park here, and meets the needs of the activity center, meaning we don't have a minimum, you figure it out. But among the various many options, do not assume that your market is going to park in the nearby neighborhood. That's exactly what I was thinking about.
Great, thank you.
Ben. Ben, are you there?
Yes, sorry, little spotty
All right.
service, but I'm here. Thank you. Andrea, I'm going to make a quick comment, and then you tell me if I'm off or not. It sounds like when we're talking about activity centers as a group, we are using kind of a lowercase a, lowercase c, and talking about Hyde Park and other places where there are activity occurring. But I think from the city's perspective, we're talking about activity centers with capital A, capital C, as designated in Blueprint Boise in the kind of comp plan long-term land use map, which are 12 or so hard intersections designated with a red activity center dot. Am I saying that correctly?
Yes. So when we are specifying throughout our code, we are obviously trying to implement Blueprint Boise. So we would be referring to those mixed use activity centers that are identified throughout our comp plan. We've got neighborhood activity centers, we've got community activity centers, and we have regional activity centers. And so when we talk about some of those examples, so we might talk about Bound Crossing or the mall or downtown, those are specified as activity centers. We might talk about some other things that may not fall, that you're exactly what you're talking about, that small a and c, just places where activity seems to be occurring naturally.
Perfect, thank you.
And then Marissa.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I do a lot of home visits in a lot of neighborhoods all across the Treasure Valley. And one thing I've seen probably within the last 2 years is just a lot of doubling up of families. As housing prices rise, we're seeing more roommate situations and adult children living with their parents and that sort of thing. And which means that there's getting to be more cars parked on the street in the residential areas. So I am not opposed to reducing parking, even within the big NACs, because you could go to any corner grocery store and there's a lot of unused space that's just blacktop heating up the air. What I'm cautious about is that there are areas of town where there is no public transit, or there is an identified bus route and the bus comes twice a day, which is not adequate. And so having some sort of something in the code that kind of differentiates between different areas of town and the different levels of service they have for public transportation. And then if in 20 years Southwest Boise does actually get a bus stop that is robust and utilized widely by the community, then maybe there would be room to reevaluate the parking standards if the property owners wanted to come back and see if they could reduce parking and put something else in those unused spaces. So that was my only comment.
Thank you. And then we did have a comment that I'd like to address from Richard as well. And so he has noted that the south side of State Street becomes Garden City west of Collister. Beyond Glenwood, the major issue is the jurisdiction is ITD rather than ACHD, and high occupancy vehicle lanes are illegal by state law. This means no bus stops in the near future. CCDC agrees it may well be 10 to 15 years. So just to clarify is that we can have bus stops along State Street, and yes, high occupancy vehicles are prohibited by our current state law, but we can have those bus stops. So we do have a State Street transit plan that takes into account the multiple jurisdictions along State Street, talking about where those will exist and how they'll exist. So it may just be stopping at the curb line or creating, natural pullouts, those types of things.
So Andrea, one of the things that 2 or 3 people have raised then several people raised the changing nature of State Street as it goes through the community and out of the community. But I wanted to point out one of the things that will appear in Module 2, unless somebody tells me not to, is a reduction for parking, minimum parking. And in addition, you got the table, and then you've got a table, then you've got some conversion factors based on where you are. So yes, there is, you know, in the clip that I showed you, there's one number for bar or restaurant, but it makes a big difference whether it's P2, P3, or general or somewhere else. Of course, what we are going to propose, and what most modern codes have, is a set of reductions. And the way you draft them is tricky. So I think several people will be interested, and I'm listening hard, how you draft the reduction for being near an activity center or a transit-oriented, a transit line. So it is not uncommon to say, if you are within an 1/8 mile, 660 feet, you know, a block and a half of a transit stop with active transit service, then you can reduce this by a certain factor, which tends to do, instead of having to map, well, it's higher here and it's lower there, or it's different in an activity center, it tends to calibrate it to, well, is there really transit there or not? This could be mapped as an activity center, but it has very little transit today. So one of the things that some codes do is to say, if you're near a transit center with headways of 30 minutes or 15 minutes or less, meaning as transit expands and the frequency of transit improves and more people ride because they don't have to wait a long time for a bus, the parking standards go down. So I think a couple of people have brushed up on that. You know, it's a good idea, but there are places that don't have transit and will not have transit for some time. And so the way we can get at that is simply through that transit reduction. Don't reduce it if the transit is planned, or reduce it less if the transit's planned, but it's going to be a long way down the road, as opposed to one that already has a stop, and we hope that frequencies increase. So.
Okay, we do have another hand raised from Brad. So Brad, I'll hand it over.
Hi there. Yeah, this parking subject's a big one. You can come at it from so many angles here. So I'll try to wrap this up into a bundle here, but I know it's kind of hard to believe for a lot of people but Boise was more of a rural city up until just recently. And, you know, our activity centers were BSU, the fairgrounds, and downtown. And like somebody else said, Hyde Park could not be an activity center if we had to meet today's standards. Hyde Park used to be held in the street down by Lucky 13. Since all these people are here now, they've had to move to the park. That's a park, you know, it doesn't need to be that much parking there. But anyway, everybody knows my battle is the neighborhoods and protecting the old neighborhoods. And as Marissa had said, you know, more people are living in the same old neighborhoods where families are doubling up. You know, every kid drives a car now. You know, an old neighborhood that used to be quiet is now busy, even though it hasn't changed any. So I guess transportation is probably what I would say is public transportation is probably the answer to a lot of this. You know, when you used to go downtown, you were prepared to have to look for parking. A good parking garage, you know, in an area that, you know, you would expect to go there. Now, if you went down to Bardnay or something over there by BSU, there's a chance you're not getting in there because you just can't. There's not enough parking. So my suggestion, I guess, is to upgrade the public transit, or even add maybe some shuttles, just some local area shuttles to move people around. I'm not opposed to minimizing the parking. I really don't care. I live out in the country anyway, so it doesn't really mean anything to me. But if it reduces those blacktop areas where it's really hot, you know, that kind of stuff, I'm all for it. But anyway, that's my 2 cents. Thanks.
Thanks.
All right.
Should we take our break, Andrea?
I think this is a great time to do that. It's now 4:05. So if we take a 5-minute break and join everybody back at 4:10, we can all stretch and regroup.
Thank you. We'll be back.
All right, it's 4:10. So I'd like to welcome everybody back. While we were gone, we did have a couple of notes that were sent. So in our chat, so Byron has said, as an architect that designs housing, a reduction of just one space per dwelling unit, as well as exempting small infill lot development from parking minimums, as Don has suggested, would make a huge difference in housing availability. I'm also ideologically aligned with the removal of parking minimums where possible. Ian has responded, stating, I agree with Brian, too often a multifamily project becomes, oh, is somebody getting some feedback? While we were gone, we did have a couple of notes that were sent. So in our chat, so Byron has said, as an architect that designs housing, just one. Okay, let's see. So Ian has stated, I agree with Byron. Too often multifamily projects becomes, can we make a parking lot pencil out, usually to the detriment of the design of the project? And Byron responded, exactly. So that was some discussion that was happening in the background just to get everybody all caught up.
All right. Shall we continue?
Let's do it.
Are you seeing my screen?
Yep, and it looks like it's in presentation mode, so you're good to go.
All right, let's talk landscaping, another popular topic. Just go through a few slides and I won't dwell on this as much as I did on parking. One of the things about many landscaping ordinances is that they're poorly organized, so they just ramble on and on about different aspects of why green is good. In general, our view is that modern codes deal with this and in terms of, look, there are only about 4 things that you need to do. You need to buffer the street frontage. Everybody loves street trees. You need to buffer yourself on the edges, which could be the parking lot edges too, against neighbors that are similar to you. And the example I sometimes give is if Taco Bell is next to McDonald's, they're usually not required to buffer because, no offense to either company, it's the same thing. They are of similar scale, they're of a similar use. If they want to, they can, but there's not a public interest in buffering the same thing from the same thing, just like there's not much of a public interest in buffering me from my neighbor's residential house. If we want to do it, we could do it. Not sure why the city would make us do it. It's ended at things that are different uses or different scales or intensities. The interiors of parking lots are almost always required to be landscaped. Some places do building foundations, meaning if you got a big parking lot and then you got a building, you do some plantings along the foundation because it breaks up this large, hard area of concrete parking lot or asphalt parking lot and then a solid building facade. That's not usually used very often in urban context. You can't put all the details in a landscaping chapter, and so many of them refer to a known or a recognized American Society of Landscape Architects set of samples or something the city has adopted, like the design standards I referred to earlier, outside the code because it quickly gets into landscape architect speak, which only landscape architects understand or need to understand. I said there are only 4 things, but there is a 5th one. There are places that are saying, in addition to doing those 3 or those 4, we really want to either get a certain minimum amount of tree canopy or we want to get minimum green area per lot. Washington, Seattle, Indianapolis have done systems like that where they say, okay, add up how much you did to comply with our street frontage, edge buffers, interiors of parking lots, if we required parking foundations. Are you at X% lot coverage? If not, plant something more. I don't care if it's on your roof. I don't care if it's on a patio. When stared at from space, we want a certain amount of it green. It could be a vertical wall because we're looking for cooling. We're looking for carbon dioxide absorption. And whether you hit that target doing in the first 4 or not will vary based on the site. But if you're low because you have a very big site and you didn't have to do much of this, you need to do more. So that is happening. Not a big trend, a small trend around the country of cities that saying, we got a number in mind, not just a goal, we got a number. We're going to look at your site plan and expect you to hit that number. And if not, we're going to say, so Bill, where do you want to plant some more stuff? Almost all newer codes have water conservation and drought tolerance standards too. So often there's a chapter right at the beginning that says, there's a general landscaping. When we say plant trees and shrubs, what are they? What are the minimum size? What are the minimum species? Or can you not plant invasive species or non-durable species? Increasingly, they say, and you got to meet these water efficiency standards. Irrigation, either yes or no. It used to be thou shalt irrigate. Increasingly in new ordinances as well, you may irrigate. Often it's a limited amount of irrigation. You may not irrigate your whole site for new development. You can do 25% of it. And if you do, you're going to have to use water conserving irrigation. Tree preservation is a slow trend around the country, meaning everybody kind of likes old trees to be preserved because they absorb a lot more carbon dioxide than new trees, but they get, it could be right in the middle of your lot, your development site. It makes the lot unusable. And if you love trees, you'd say, well, then don't build there. And the property owner says, that's really not an option. I own this. I have a right to do things under zoning. If I keep that tree, I can't build anything. So that is, but slowly there has been a growing trend around the country to say, you will preserve the big ones or replace them. And if it's a replacement, it's usually not 1 inch to 1 inch, it's more. You're going to have to do 2 inches for the 1 inch you take out of diameter. Stormwater integration is a trend. How do you lay these out? Either we encourage you or we require you to do your open space and landscaping in a way that will help treat stormwater so we don't have to put it in pipes. And again, street frontage landscaping always deals with trees and materials. And is it one per 40 feet, one per 35 feet, one for 60 feet in different areas? Or do you have to have smaller pedestrian scale trees in very urban areas? So those are basics. And then in buffers, I did want to show you yet another table. And this is really a simplified version of if you're doing X and you're next to Y, we have defined areas, defined types of buffers, A, B, C, D. This comes out of some of your design standards. And so again, I'm repeating on the left-hand side, kind of what are we concerned about? The street frontage I talked about earlier, side and rear perimeters when you're different from something else, parking lot areas, and then buffers between uses of different scales, same thing. So Blueprint Boise says water conservation, and it tells you how. Usually zoning ordinances don't talk about plumbing fixtures. They sometimes encourage you by giving you a bonus if you hit certain sustainability incentives, and you can help achieve them by putting in low flow plumbing fixtures, but they don't tell you. The building code usually tells you what plumbing fixtures are compliant and what are not. It is a little dangerous for zoning to get into the exact materials or the exact things you're going to use to build your building other than sometimes facades. So low flow, irrigation, drought tolerant, native all over Blueprint Boise. Preserve a high percentage of native vegetation and encourage native materials. So that's in Blueprint Boise. And then promote landscape materials that require minimal use of pesticides and fertilizers. Those are among the things it says. So let me focus on this. We could talk about anything you'd like to talk about from the things I've said, or anything you want to talk about. But there is seldom much debate about street trees. You don't often get people standing up and saying, I don't like them. And usually the city has a system by which it tries to create street trees. Most of the time, how many trees are in a parking lot interior is a technical issue. I think it's too high. I think it's too low. But here's the one I'd like to focus on. How much edge buffering should Boise be requiring between uses of arguably different scales or intensities? Are there things that you can think about in your neighborhood or that you've seen built or that you did build or design where you walked away and said, the city really should not be requiring that? Or as a citizen, you said, I don't know why they didn't require more landscaping on that site to buffer it from what's around it. So I'll be quiet. That's the question.
Okay, to get us started, Richard has posted a comment saying that these landscape policies are in Blueprint Boise and I like them, but they are, in my observation, rarely followed.
Well, the short answer to that is 2 parts in my mind. A, put them in the code. And B, here's the issue. I will say one more thing. If you don't put them in the code, if they're just advisory, then often they won't be followed. I hate to sound like a jerk, but I think there's a huge difference between a shall and a should. Should means, oh, you want me to do it? Great. I don't want to do it. That's not a very powerful position to be in. The hard part about what we're all gathered to do is to say, what is a shall? So if you put it in and it works, it will be enforced. I will say this: many Usually the way zoning works is they look at a site plan. Do you have enough trees? Are the trees in the right place? Is that enough shrubs? Is the parking lot got landscaping? Yes. Okay, check mark. Go pull a building permit and we'll inspect it. Sometimes cities don't do a good job of inspecting to make sure they're actually planted. I don't know whether Boise does a good job of that or not. Most cities do. The problem is 5 years later, it's died. 5 years later, somebody new owns the property. I share the frustration that Richard's expressing. I as a planner, I walk around and say, don't you care about your property? All your trees are dead. Your shrubs are dead. They're filled with trash. And so there are enforcement issues. Module 2 will include a new chapter about if we required you to do landscaping, it needs to stay alive. And it is a violation of the zoning ordinance not to keep alive and keep landscaped the areas of the property that you were required to landscape or not landscape when you got your approval. So that's unlike zoning. It's something you point to in the zoning ordinance that says, this is not about getting a building permit. This is about how you operate it afterwards. And signs and landscaping and lighting are the 3 areas where you don't want somebody coming in 10 years down the road and saying, I don't like that light. I'm going to put in this one. It's got a lot more light. It does, hurts the neighbors, but hey, I'm the guy who owns the property, not realizing that that was part of your site plan. You needed to have that kind of a light to protect the neighbors. And if we required it, then you are going to have to maintain it that way.
So Roberta has provided a comment that we've talked about wildfire or fire-wise practices. Will this be incorporated in the landscape section? While it's only semi-applicable in my area, fire-wise landscaping is critical. So.
Good question, Roberta. It's a great question. You have some of the things that obliquely get at those things in foothills and hillsides that tend to get at that, trying to move things so they're in less risky areas or put them on less risky areas. However, usually it is, if we were to address WUI, the wildland urban interface, and wildfires, and frankly, I encourage people to, it's usually done through an overlay district rather than through landscaping. It could be done in landscaping. For example, we have seen ordinances that say in hillside areas or areas that refer to this map over here, if you are in a mapped area maintained by somebody, the state, the fire district, somebody who does professional evaluations of fire risk, you've got to do the following, and you can't put the trees and shrubs within 30 feet of your house. That's the defensible space requirement. So we have seen it done, and we could do it. If we want to pursue this, I'd like to scratch my head a little bit about, is it a new overlay district we didn't include in module 1? Is it revisions to some of the WUI areas tend to be hillside and foothills types areas, but hillsides. Is it a change to those standards, or is it landscaping? So I'm going to take your comment that you'd like us to think about that and address it in some way, unless you pipe up in the chat and say, no, I didn't mean that.
Yes, and Dawn, that would be a really great fit in our wildland urban interface. So we actually have a mapped boundary that identifies, where we have potential fire risk. So that's where that would be appropriate.
Okay.
And then I have two comments from the chat. So Jessica has said, I would like to see xeriscaping requirements in the code. So that's interesting. And I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. Would you like to see that as a requirement or an option or an available tool for you to use? And then Marissa has said, every subdivision has landscaped berm covered in grass, which is not water-wise, and we should be thinking about that. So I'd like to follow up with Jessica first. So would you like that to be, the xeriscaping to be an actual requirement or simply just an option? And then we do have Ian with a raised hand, as well as Byron. So.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, I would love to see and would love feedback from any landscape architects and design folks in the group here. But I think especially in new subdivisions and new areas of the development, especially like south of town. I mean, we're in a desert. Why not promote xeriscaping? And there's a lot of great plant material that could be used and even provide shade, I think. in those newer areas. I also understand the conflict that we have about maintaining the tree canopy as well. So I think some overlays districts perhaps in new development areas, say south of town, and even in the foothills perhaps. And I don't know if it's better to incentivize it or make it a requirement, but we just see grass everywhere, and especially this summer, not only fire, but just drought and water usage. I think it's something the city needs to be proactively looking at.
No, that's great. And, we do have some options that, you can use those as incentives. As, part of a menu, you also have the ability to really talk about encouraging the use of those things by providing options with those native plant species that exist or flourish in our areas. I know some, California, Arizona often have requirements to do those types of things. So that kind of gets into preference, creativity. So yes, we're going to definitely want to think about water-wise. We're hearing about wells drying up. We're hearing about depletion of our aquifer. We've got some environmental stewardship we need to be thinking about in Blueprint Boise. So, just keeping those all thoughts in our mind as we move forward is great.
Andrea, I'm
go
sorry
ahead.
to interrupt. Do you remember though, like I just know in designer's view where we looked at some plans and we can't use, or maybe there's a limit on the mulch material, and like rock mulch is not permitted. Like DG is not permitted, but like you mentioned, Arizona and California, that's a very common material.
Yep. So our current landscape ordinance does allow us to use rock mulch. There is one caveat that goes with that. So if you choose to use a rock mulch, you are required to provide enough species that'll provide 50% coverage within 5 years of planting. So that we are getting that coverage that we're looking for. So it's not a large expanse of rock, which is going to emit heat, right? And create that heat island effect that you'd get with asphalt or paving, those types of things. So that we are looking for that softening, that heat absorption, those types of things.
And I would, if I could weigh in just quickly, I'm interested in this conversation. Most newer codes, if they care about this issue, just require it. They just set standards. No more than X can be irrigated, and you need to be doing Y amount of either xeriscape or drought tolerant and native vegetation. The reason is this: when people say incentives, carrots are always more popular than sticks. But frankly, I don't think it makes sense to give away density. We've already talked about parking and reducing. What is the appropriate intensity for planting something different and designing it somewhat differently? Increasingly, especially in the Western US, people are like, we're not going to give away density for your landscaping choices. We're going to require them, basically, or we will require less if you do less landscaping area if you do more of it the way we want it to. But when people hear this word incentive, I would want to have a longer conversation. My temptation is to say, don't give away density either directly or indirectly. It's not a further parking reduction. It's not a further lot coverage reduction. It is simply a matter of deciding what's good for Boise, and water availability plays a bigger and bigger role, and decide what the rules are and do them. It is more likely a regulation than an incentive these days, because half of water use is outside the house.
Okay, so we do have some additional comments followed by some hand raised. So Roberta has said, yes, we need to address the wildland urban interface and fire risk. It can be a combination of both depending on the location. Xeriscaping would be great, and she would like to see that increased. However, some homeowners associations are adverse to xeriscaping, and it's a challenge sometimes in the area. Richard has said there's xeriscaping or water-wise, often low maintenance, often native perennials, and then xeriscaping, which is lava rocks, gravel with very few or any plants. He's a fan of the true, stylized xeriscaping, not just having the rocks that create that heat island effect. Patrick has followed up saying, I support the idea of having a menu that successfully encourages a lot of this. However, I do worry about being too detail oriented or specific, that it would make for unexpected and unintended details at the site level. I want to point out the connection between the issue and the previous one. One way to reduce the heat island effect is to reduce the amount of parking. Shellen has said, I think water efficient planting and irrigation is very low hanging fruit as a requirement. Devil is in the details, but this is 2021. We need to require it. It's good for the environment, the community, and it does not add any additional costs. Patrick has followed up with good points, Shellen. He agrees. Francis says, I agree with Shellen. And Roberta has also said, I agree with Shellen. The low-hanging fruit is becoming more prominent with drought and heat. So I'd like to follow up with Ian and then Byron. And go ahead.
Yeah, I won't belabor the point, but I agree with all that is being said. It's a challenge. We live in the city of trees, but at the same time, we're very firmly in a drought right now, and it's rather warm. So you gotta balance both of them. I think it would be interesting to explore. I believe Marissa said this, overlays for xeriscaping and overlays for tree canopy. I don't know, if it makes more sense around downtown core and some of the maybe older established neighborhoods to have a tree canopy overlay that encourages people to keep their trees or discourages them from removing them, conversely. And then as you get out from the downtown core, as you get further away from the river, maybe have a xeriscaping overlay where there is more options available to you, as opposed to just doing the landscape buffer, or the grass buffer with the trees planted along it. So I think all very good points.
All right, Byron.
Geez, thanks, Ian, for setting me up for my comment. Pretty much very similar comment. As a designer, one thing I've seen with conventional parking lot screening methods, and Don had a really great slide, a couple slides back, that really kind of shows the implications of what happens when you screen a parking lot so heavily that what you end up with are these small unusable strips of green space. Really, the only thing you can do, yeah, that's a great slide there, Don, thanks. All you can do on some of these strips of land really is plant landscaping material. The more we require those screening methods, the less options a designer has to take on-site stormwater drainage and retention into account, into larger, more usable pieces of land that can then, I guess, do double and triple duty by not only increasing the amount of space offered for large plantings like trees, but also usable outdoor spaces too. So the more we fragment up the remaining land after we've done our architectural design and our parking lot design, the less opportunity we have for usable outdoor spaces, which can also become drainage swales, effective drainage swales, where we're treating our stormwater on site rather than sending it downstream. As a designer, you really do want to kind of try to combine as many of those useful spaces and useful components together and give your owners and the public more usable spaces. So that's one downside I've seen just with conventional parking lot design, conventional landscaping, buffer requirements, and certainly burns are part of that, where you have to raise the land. You can't retain water on those berm strips, and what you have in terms of privacy is kind of working against you for future drainage or future swale stormwater retention on site.
Okay. Good comments.
All right, so we've got some comments happening too. So Jessica has said these are great comments by all. Esther, with climate change, we need to have both trees and xeriscape throughout the city to help reduce the impacts of increased temperatures. Richard has stated, I understand the point of fragmentation and may agree, but we can use those strips of land to be pollinator or songbird habitat, but rarely do. So there's a lot of really good comments out there.
I can't see the chat box or the hands because of the way I'm configured today, but we have about 25 minutes. Shall we move on to the third question?
I think we should, in the essence of time. We do have 3 attendees, so I'd like to leave some time at the end for that. So let's go ahead and move forward, and we'll catch up with our participants at the very end.
Great. So the last big topic that we wanted to highlight today, also one that people feel strongly about sometimes. We've showed you the cover again. I talked at the beginning, and I won't repeat what I said earlier. We have, what are the trends? The trends are to have general building design standards for multifamily and for, not for single family, for multifamily and mixed use and sometimes non-residential, meaning light industrial and industrial buildings. Usually the heaviest zone of industry does not have them, but below that, industry these days tends to be more or less like a business park if you're building a new one. So get the basics in there, leave the design manual stuff out, focus on building and parking location. Is it near, does the city care in this context, in this zone district, where the parking is in relation to the building? I've already tipped my hand, yes. Most of the time there is antipathy towards parking lots in front of buildings that separate pedestrians from the building entrances, with the exception of inherently spread out and suburban areas where people kind of say, this is just the only way to get around here is a car, and the most convenient place to park a car is in front, and this is not going to be pedestrian oriented. So there are places where street enclosure is just going to be a long way down the road if it ever happens. Focus on street entrances. Are there required doors, windows, and focus on articulation, blank walls. This can be defined in terms of no more than X square feet with a blank wall, or it can be defined as in no more than X linear feet without breaking it up somewhere, a protrusion, an inset, a change of materials, whatever it is. Again, in these areas, bring the parts, the concepts of the citywide design standards, not guidelines, standards, the share of those that are shalls. The trend is to say, let's come up with standards and then define the box of administrative flexibility to vary from those, but for a good reason, without going through a hearing, without having the hearing be about, well, I want to do a different approach to facade articulation. I want to do a different approach to windows. Can you say, my difference is I don't want to have any? No, there's a defined range of administrative approvals. And again, in Boise, I just want everybody to understand this. If this proposal goes forward, there are things in the code and an ability to vary them for design reasons in the code, which settles some aspects of building design that are not going to be rehashed when you go through the design review process. They are intended to say, this part, we may debate various things in the design review process, and you guys have gotten some great buildings out of that process. But we're not debating it all. We are trying to set a threshold in the code. Do you have to do it this way? No. Do most cities do it this way? Yes. And don't go too far. Do not try to be the architect. I'll say this is another way of doing it again. Usually there are graphics like this in the code with illustrations pointing at what you're talking about. Building entrances, facade articulation, parking location, transparency means windows. And again, a benchmark at the bottom saying, look, if there are other shalls in here, they are shall. Where you may still go through the design review process, but those are shalls. Now, in installment 3, we will have to face the issue: should everybody who goes through design review today have to go through it tomorrow with a new code? In some cities, they say no. If you could get this basic stuff in the activity centers or small scale activity centers, we're not sure you should have to go through design review. Matter of fact, a majority of places that I have written codes for would not require discretionary design review for what I would call fairly traditional activity center, multifamily or commercial development. You do right now. That's something we'll deal with in installment 3. And the last one is simply, there are other chapters, just to let you know, we have covered them. Exterior lighting, preventing light trespass onto your neighbor's property, dealing with the energy efficiency of the lights, because lights, just like Landscaping takes a lot of water use. Exterior lighting, if you buy the wrong fixtures, in American cities in general, absorbs a lot of energy use. Why is it? How do you want to save energy? Then think about exterior lighting and require people to buy energy efficient fixtures. Signs has been reworked, but not dramatically. And I mentioned earlier that operations and maintenance is a new chapter. So here's what Blueprint Boise says, develop illustrative design standards, encourage creativity, performance-based design, again, for employment, mixed-use commercial, and neighborhood development. Promote adaptive reuse of historic buildings rather than demolition. That means allowing them to be reused without, coming up with design standards that don't make it hard to reuse buildings. Encourage residential infill. We've talked about that. Incorporate a variety of features, which could be materials, architectural detailing, facade articulation. I said earlier, Blueprint Boise says a lot of words about activity centers and walkability and sustainability and pedestrian orientedness and also building design. This is one of the things which when you read it, you kind of say, wow, they really care about building design. This plan is dwelling on it more than many plans do. So here's the question. What elements of building design are most important to maintain the character of Boise for corridors, centers, and neighborhoods outside downtown? Let's not talk about downtown right now. If you want to, of course, you can. You've got a pretty sophisticated system. You've gotten some good stuff out of it. The real question is, outside of those areas and citywide, think about neighborhood or community scale or other activity centers or the State Street corridor. What are the things that ought to be in the code as opposed to negotiated each time through the guidelines?
So we don't have anything in the chat or anybody raised hands. So we'll just wait a little bit and see what our thoughts are.
I'm kind of surprised. We got some designers in the group who either might like it or not like it. I won't say anymore. We'll just wait.
Byron, you're up.
Sorry for taking everybody's time for every single one of these questions, but I think to Don's question, preservation certainly very important. Needlessly losing some of our iconic and character building structures would certainly be a shame, and should be incentivized for retaining those and adaptive reuse certainly as much as possible. Scale, possibly height, and development format or building form might also be very critical, especially in activity centers around neighborhoods. But almost everything else seems fairly more specific than I'd want to be, I guess, for a comment.
That's what I was expecting you to say, Byron. No, you've been very consistent in your advocacy for enough flexibility for designers to do good work, and your comments right there are very consistent with that position. So understood.
Okay, we have Patrick Spouts up next.
I echo Byron's comments and agree with what he just shared. And to add something meaningful to that, I want to point out that sometimes when places get very prescriptive about things like articulation and changes in color, you end up producing something that is homogeneous in its own way because it's the only way to satisfy the design requirements. And that homogeneity of new builds, it can also be undesirable to some people as well.
Okay, let me ask a follow-up here. When we started this process 2 years ago, or 1 year ago, we started 2 years ago and then we restarted it 9 months ago. In those initial discussions, to be very candid, we heard a lot of criticism of the design review process because of time, expense, and unpredictability. And I will be happy to be corrected. What I heard was time and expense and citizens feeling that it was operating unpredictably in the way that they thought this result would not have come out of that process. Disappointed in not the quality, nobody ever said that they expected something different. They don't know how the process could have produced this result. So I don't want to dwell on this. It does sound to me like when I heard that 2 years ago, 1 year ago, we put it in our assessment, and we've been dwelling on it, and that's kind of the approach we've taken. I will say, in this committee, the discussion's been very different. It's been very much people who I think like the current process, or certainly are more worried about making these objective standards than they are worried about the continuation of the current process. So somebody clue me in. Am I hearing from two different crowds, or did I mishear it the first time? Because this group has been very, I think, nobody's saying, get rid of the design review process and let me do what I want to do. We are saying, be careful what you put in the code, Don, because good design is what designers do, but I'm not hearing any criticism of the current design review standards or process. Do you love them?
Since you're following up on my comment, I'm for liberalizing them as you would expect, loosening and allowing for more flexibility while having something to avoid the things that we most don't like. So I'm actually sympathetic to those complaints that you heard originally, especially with the unpredictability. I would rather have a list of things like, these are the 10 things we really can't let you do, rather than having 100 things saying, these are the specific things you must do, and have some of them be a little contradictory.
Okay.
I don't think that we heard it specifically toward the design review process. I think that we heard that the overall process. So whether you're going through the conditional use permit, people, specifically developers, felt like that it was very weighty. It took a lot of time, and time is money. Those are the things that I think we heard. But we do have two hands raised, and one of those individuals is actually a design review committee member, Jessica Aguilar, who's going to give us some feedback, I'm sure, in regard to that. And then we'll follow up by Ian.
I'm okay with the process. I'm afraid if we give more control or keep it more at the admin level, I think you will get more unpredictable outcomes, and lose some transparency, for lack of a better word, that we want to have and provide to the community. In terms of what's happening in their neighborhoods, like the new ICCU building, for example. There's a lot of community involvement in that project, providing us feedback. And I'm afraid if we put these standards at the admin level, a lot of folks wouldn't be heard as to their concerns on projects like that. I wanted to make, if I can remember what I think Patrick said, or someone said, give us a list of things that you can't do. I don't know that's a good solution either, because I think that potentially takes creativity away, opportunities away from the design teams. I'd rather see new options, more options than saying, no, you can't do this, because there might be some alternate solutions and more creative ways to do things. And I wish what we could get some teeth on, though, is we see a lot of projects that come through and they get approved and they look amazing. And especially in this climate, and I know all the architects and developers will be nodding their head when I say this, they get their projects approved and then they go and budget them or get the construction documents going, and they have to value engineer them because the costs are just crazy, especially now. And so things get taken away from the design, value engineered out, if you will, VE, we call it VE. And so there's a couple of buildings downtown, for example, I won't identify them specifically, but what we approved at DR is not what got constructed. And we didn't have an opportunity to see those again. And unfortunately, I think the quality went down. So I guess I'm in support of leaving it the way it is and taking the time to get a better project, a better design for the community in general. Thank you.
All right. So Shellen has provided some comments. The things we want to prioritize, such as affordable housing, net zero buildings, etc., should get administrative design review. Time is money. Uncertainty is worse from a development perspective. Patrick is excited about a specific literary find by Byron, and he is pro flexibility. Fair point about losing creativity. Shellen's followed up with, also, are there any statistics on how many projects get appealed at either DR or P&Z? If it's a high number, then the process doesn't work in my opinion. Yes, I'm an affordable housing developer, so take it with a grain of salt, I suppose. I can get that information and follow up in regard to that. Richard states, from a neighborhood perspective, I've been surprised at how much the overall design and appearances make as to whether a large development is eventually accepted. I've seen the current process produce both. Considering this, I think design review with some teeth can really make a better project. Then we also have Ian's hand raised as well, so we want to make sure that we hear from him.
I won't reiterate anything that's already been said. I agree with most of the sentiments from everybody. I will say, as a designer, yes, there is some uncertainty, but I do appreciate that it holds projects to a certain quality. I wouldn't want to give away some of that by making it more open. And I guess to Jessica's point, if it gets VE'd, it needs to be re-examined. So I agree with those statements.
All right, I don't see any more chat happening or any hands raised, but it is 4:52. I want to make sure that we give ample time we have 3 attendees with us today. So we have Alexandra Monjar, Diane Ranane, and Nina Schaefer. So if any one of them would like to visit with us, I encourage you to go ahead and participate. Alexandra, did you want to say anything to our committee?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, awesome. I think that the points that the committee has been making, the questions that you're asking, and how you're responding to these are, I think obviously there's some good discussion, different viewpoints, and I think the views that I have been mentioned. So.
Great. Thank you for joining us. Diane Ranane, do you have anything that you'd like to add or visit with us about?
Hi, yes, I was just mainly listening so that I can learn. And it's been especially the parking stuff is very interesting, and the landscaping. And because I live in the foothills and I've had my own home Firewise looked at, and also because the East End Neighborhood Association is about to embark on Firewise training for people who live in this area. We'll have our own programs and be able to answer people's questions. I would suggest that as you're looking at these maps you're going to perhaps make of where to do Firewise stuff, that you be a little bit more broad than just those in the foothills. There's a movie that the Firewise program has, a video, and it's very educational about just how far fire can travel. And right now, as you all know, we are in a precarious position, and it's not just going to be here right here where I'm in Aldapi Heights. It could be in the North End. It could be anywhere. So I think that's a really critical thing for you guys to make sure that there's plenty of stuff in the zoning regulations that require that kind of thing. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Nina, did you have anything? And I may be slaughtering your name. If it's Nina, please accept my apology.
No worries. Yes, it is Nina, but it wasn't a full slaughter. Yeah, thank you so much. I think a lot of my views, as Alexandra said, has been shared with this group, and I am just so happy to hear that. I'm the president of the Lust District Neighborhood Association, and in terms of the design standards, this came up in our meeting this week. We have a couple development projects coming in that we are looking forward to having, but we would like to see more more thought into the first level building of it that kind of provides more welcoming feels to the buildings in that area. Right now, and Dawn, just in case you're not familiar with the area, it's primarily off-campus student housing, which is we're very close to Boise State, so we get and we support, but a lot of them haven't really implemented the mixed use zoning in the area, and we would love to see more activation on that street level that engages not only the students with the neighbors, but vice versa, and allows for more retail development in the area. So I really like the idea of focusing on that first level to be very pedestrian friendly. And I kind of think about that with the activity centers as well, as putting less priority on the parking and putting more priority on the people that are going to be right next to the building eventually. So thank you everyone for all your thoughts and ideas.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. And again, I apologize. You can call me Andrea. It'll be an even exchange. But I want to thank everybody today. You guys, we had excellent conversation. And I don't know if you've been tracking about the participation levels, but today we had everybody but 3 people verbally participate in our discussion today on our committee. That's awesome. This is really encouraging. This is important stuff. We want to hear what you think. So you guys did awesome. And I'm so proud of you guys. Please know that this is not the end of our discussion. We will go ahead and follow up with the minutes with you tomorrow. As always, you'll have a post Citywide Advisory Committee survey, and we've added that additional section. So if you want to provide additional comments that go above and beyond what we just talked about, those 3 major questions, give us that information. That's what we're looking for. So we'll go ahead and send that out to you. We had excellent attendees. Today's meeting was super exciting to me. So I'm very excited, very proud of all of us talking about the city and the community as a whole and how we can make it better. So this is great. Anybody else want to follow up with anything before we leave? Well, if not, then I guess let's adjourn the meeting, and we will be back in August on that 3rd Thursday. And it's going to be an exciting meeting because we're going to see the draft module 2. We're going to have an opportunity to navigate what that looks like, what all of our discussions have brought forth. So we're going to see all of those fruits that we've been working on for so long. So thank you again, everybody, and we'll see you in August.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.